Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome, my dear faves, to the 11th part of What If Minato Yeeted Himself and His Son into the World of Demon Slayer. Credit goes to SapavemLasae. Chapter 37. A fox, dragon, turtle, and a boar. The first thing Minato notes, when everything comes back into focus, is that the breeze is a lot more prominent than it should be. The next thing he noticed was that the wall along the side of the lab was missing. No, not missing, but gone. He stands outside, having dragged both girls with him through Hirishin as he stares into the room they were just in. The scent of wisteria is thick even outside. He lets go of Shinobi and Aoi after he makes sure they are steady, eyeing the destruction quizzically. He pulses his chakra, catching the way yang chakra coats nearly everything in a thin sheet. The demon blood is gone. What little traces of it were left in the vial burned away by the wisteria poison. It's potent, more potent than Minato ever thought possible. He can only guess as to why the experiment had such explosive results. Surely, adding that little bit of yang chakra shouldn't have been enough of an imbalance? Or was it caused by something else? Minato looks over at Shinobu to find she looks just as confused as he does. Outside of their bubble, Kikuchi and other members of the estate are wandering by. Some look frantic and worried, while others are in shock. Then, Minato hears a familiar voice. Minato, Shinobu. Kanae calls as she rushes over. Her steps are quick, and he's rather certain the girl doesn't even realize she's using chakra for it. Kanae slams into Shinobu, her hands glowing green as she cups the girl's face in worry and checks her over. She shifts to Minato once she's certain Shinobu is fine. When he waves her off, her attention drops to Aoi. The girl looks flustered under the attention. Sanemi is right behind Kanae, his eyes moving to the wreckage with a sharp glint filling them. He steps closer to the chakra-infused disaster zone. Minato joins him, surveying the damage with a closer eye. He finds the vial easily, its contents exploded outward and steaming. The rest of the assortment isn't much better. But perhaps the most surprising is the poison. Sanemi touches it before Minato can stop him, and it does little more than trail down his fingers. The hue of it is closer to blue than purple, but the odor it gives off is distinctly wisteria. Minato crouches down next to the destroyed microscope, taking note of how there are burns along the surface. Specifically, chakra burns. He hasn't seen anything like this during his time here. Actually, he hasn't seen anything like this since he was first learning to control the Kyuubi. Pure chakra was nearly intolerable for people. It had to be broken down or spliced into something else. Chakra poisoning was a thing and often led to young civilians being unable to become ninja. Shinobi were less likely to have a negative reaction due to exposure. But from sources like the Biju, it could and did still happen. Minato swallows thickly, pressing his hands over the burns. What would have caused this reaction? What factor was different here? Other than just the chakra, what had Shinobi changed? Shinobu. What blood did you use? He asks softly. He hears shuffling, and soon the girl comes to stand behind him. It was from Kyojiro's last mission, she tells him. Minato bites back a knowing curse. That meant it was 12 Kazuki. Kyojuro had run into number 12, a low rank but still fairly strong, and taken them out. Minato still remembered receiving the call after the fact. He had appeared in the wisteria house where the boy had the gall to just laugh at his panic. While not the strongest, Minato could still recall his last run-in with both an upper and lower moon. Only one had ended without death. And that had only been because Minato had fled for the second one. Kyojuru's mission had been the real reason that Oyatakata decided to name the new Hashira, even if it had been a long time coming. His eyes flit back to the blood and he sighs deeply. "Do we have any more?" he asks, his mind already working. With a wet glance at the vial, Shinobu shakes her head. No. That was the last of it. Minato thinks back, recalling the reason they had the blood of demons in the first place was because of Tamayo. The demon had instructed Minato to take blood from high-ranking demons for her. And from there, he did. Along with that, he related the info to the higher-in-command Slayers, who took it in stride. This batch was part of what he had already sent over to Tamayo. Rising to his feet, Minato runs a tired hand through his hair. "I guess I'll be introducing you to Tamayo sooner, rather than later," he murmurs. The girls have wanted to meet the woman, but he's been hesitant. Only those closest to Minato and who were there that night know that Tamayo is a demon. Both he and the master chose to keep the fact hidden for the moment. His eyes wander again, trialing the broken remnants below him. "Minato, is everything alright?" Another voice calls, and then somebody whistles. Minato turns his head and catches the gaze of both Giyu and Sabito, the latter of the two the one who whistled. He's eyeing the destruction casually, but both of them look on edge. They relax upon seeing no one hurt. "What happened?" Giyu asks, wandering over in time with his second half. Sabito kicks part of the wreckage, before raising a brow at Minato to ask the same. Minato gains a wry smile. Experiment gone wrong. Sabito smirks at him, and maybe the boy has been spending too much time with Minato's son because it's downright mischievous. Like when you last used the Rasengan and destroyed Urokodaki sensei's tree. The boy asks cheerfully. Minato can't help the slight flush on his face, reaching to rub the back of his neck. He had forgotten about that incident. It was a little over 2 months ago now. He had been attempting to add water to his Rasengan when it went out of control and sent him flying. Urokodaki had been amicable even with his newly destroyed tree. Minato swore the man was laughing at him too. Neither Sabito nor Mikomo had let him live it down. Which of course, was why Giyu was his favorite. "Hey," he begins, but he freezes when something pings across his thoughts. It's little more than an inkling at first, but it's the source that has him stalling. Hiroko. The eyes of his companions widen a fraction. Her Hirishin seal flares, and it's an urgent ping. He doesn't wait. He's there 1 second, and the next he's vanishing in a blur of gold. When he comes to himself again, he's already reaching for his blade. Only, it's not a demon that he ends up slamming into. Rather, his blade meets the force of enough water chakra to send anyone sprawling. He pushes past it, cutting through it with wind. Then he twists, his blade held aloft while his eyes darken ahead of him. Pink eyes and mousy brown hair. The figure is short, but that does little to curb how dangerous they are. Prior to this world, Minato had only known 3 of the Jinchuriki. One was his son, and the other two were Gaara and B. This one he didn't have the misfortune of meeting. He did however know him by sight alone. What kind of cage didn't know what the other cage looked like, after all? Yagura, he calls in greeting. His form is still tense as he looks across the field at the Mizukage. Or well, the former Mizukage at any rate. Minato spares a glance behind him, if only to check on his daughter. He finds that she's barely standing and someone unexpected is holding her up. Hiryu Akuto. Minato swallows. What mess had he missed? His kunai is off to the side, and to his surprise, it doesn't look like Hiroko used it. Rather, it appears that Akuto sent it. If the way Hiroko's arm hangs limply is any indication, her blade is also nowhere to be seen. That was something to ponder another time. He turned back to the threat at hand and found that Yagura at least wasn't making a move to attack him. "I've been looking for you, Yondaime," Yagura says calmly. He's not at all like the short-tempered ruler that Kiri rumored him as. Nor did he look as bloodthirsty as the reports made him out to be. Jiraiya was hardly even wrong about such things though, so Minato maintained his suspicion. Just Minato here, I'm afraid. Konoha doesn't exist here, so neither does the Yondaime Hokage, Minato retorts. Yagura blinks at him, and then he sighs. He straightens and props his staff up next to him. Minato notes it, along with everything else. It's not the most dangerous weapon, but then again Yagura is a master with it. Even a stick can become something fearsome in the right hands. Minato hasn't had to fight anyone who matches the level of a cage here. Or at least, he hasn't had to fight someone who wasn't a demon. How rusty was he? And if this came to blows, how would he fare? He was faster than Yagura, that was a given. But Yagura could use his tailed beast to the extent that B could. And while Minato was friendly with Kurama, he still wasn't at the same level when it came to not being consumed by the Kyuubi's chakra. He wagered he could win but not without sustaining injuries. Considering you've been searching for me, why don't you tell me why? And following that, why don't you tell me why you were targeting my daughter, Minato asks, slipping into his mask as an easygoing smile crosses his features. He can feel the tension in the air spike but he doesn't get swayed by it. He has played this game longer than most. Yagura blinks, eyes shifting behind the man to where Hiroko hovers. His brow furrows, and then he shifts on his feet as his eyes take in the other. Akuto. I was mostly aiming for the other one. But, if you wish to talk, I have no qualms. I sought you for my family's protection. Minato stalls at that. He blinks, not able to catch himself in time. Yagura had a "Ha! You're the king of this land, aren't you?" Exclamation mark. "I'll take you out." A young voice suddenly cries. Minato moves, sidestepping a lunge for his midsection. A boy blurs past him. Or he thinks it's a boy. It's hard to tell when the head of a boar rests on his head and obscures his features. The boy lunges again but Minato reaches out. He grabs the boy's mask and tugs it off with one hand. Minato's leg sticks out, and the boy trips and falls into the snow. He's not wearing a shirt, which is surprising. When he sits up he doesn't even look cold. His eyes are a bright and almost toxic green as they meet Minato's. His hair is two varying shades, going from a black color at the roots to a blue color at the ends. "Inosuke." A feminine voice calls from the sidelines. Minato's gaze flicks up in time to see another figure exit the woods. She has another boy clinging to her back, and by her features, Minato immediately pegs her for the boy's mother. Minato looks back down at the boy, and he has to move to sidestep another lunge. The boy, Inosuke, keeps going for him, but he just moves around him calmly. It's not hard to, considering the boy has great muscle memory, but not the best training. Until, of course, the boy twists in a way nobody sans Orochimaru should be able to, and slams a kick into Minato's side. Did this boy not have any bones? What the hell? Minato reaches out with a wince to grab the boy's leg. He glances up and tosses the boy away with his free hand. The board head dangles from his other still. Inosuke flies through the air up until Yagura deftly grabs the boy and secures him at his side. Inosuke flails, but Yagura presses a hand to his shoulder with a long-suffering sigh. Inosuke stills and sends a sharp growl up at the man. Yagura ignores it with practiced grace, seemingly unbothered by the feral child. "I apologize. Inosuke, please, Minato is. He's who I've been searching for," Yagura tells the boy. At that, Inosuke settles, but his eyes still watch Minato carefully. It feels like the gaze of a kitten to Minato. One learning to hunt. Kinda cute. "Yagura, are you alright?" The woman suddenly speaks up, rushing over. She also checks over Inosuke, worry present on her features. Yagura nods at her, his eyes softening just a tad. Minato blinks again at the sight. He had thought his family was odd. This was something else. He never pictured the leader of the Bloody Mist to be so fatherly. Yagura looks back at Minato and then sighs. Perhaps it would be better to just start over. "I apologize for attacking you earlier," he offers, gesturing at Akuto. "It's not the first time I've been attacked." The voice comes far closer to Minato's ear than he expected, and he barely holds back from twitching as he glances to the side to see Akuto standing there. Hiroko is still propped up, but her eyes shift to meet Minato's. "T2-san," she murmurs. Her voice sounds small, and Minato's chest aches. In an instant he's at her side, tugging her close. Akuto steps back as Minato observes his daughter. She doesn't look the best, but at least she isn't in danger. He ghosts his hand over her cheek and swallows thickly when she flinches. Still, the girl leans against him. She's shaking, he realizes. What the hell happened? "We just had a run-in with the prismatic demon," Akuto tells him. Minato's blood runs cold. What? He has to do a double take on Hiroko now. He can't help but remember a grave at the master's mansion, the body of a boy far too young with a hole in his chest. He swallows thickly and then clutches the girl closer. "Where?" he begins, but Akuto is already speaking. "Gone. I can tell you specifics once we are out of the snow. And it looks like you'll have someone else to talk to," the boy says. He gestures at Yagura and the others. Minato nods, even if his thoughts are running rampant. He turns again and meets Yagura's careful gaze. The man hasn't moved away from the woman or Inosuke. "If you come with me, we can talk," he offers. Yagura nods, helping Inosuke up as he sighs. "That would be best." "Kana?" the woman suddenly voices. Hiroko goes stiff at his side and Minato glances down in worry. Hiroko lifts her head, glancing across the clearing at the woman. She stares at her with teary eyes. The woman swallows and takes a step forward, lifting her hand. It drops, however, when Yagura steps around her. He grabs her hand and shakes his head. Later, he murmurs. Hiroko turns at that, but Minato can feel how stiff she is. He swallows again, and then he reaches for his seals. He gestures for everyone to gather. Once they have, he pulls them away in a flurry of gold. All that's left of them is the trail in the snow, blood dotting the soft silver flakes. Drabble. He hasn't been annoyed like this in a while. But well, Obito had one plan. And of course, it went to shit. He glares down at the fire before him. It flares to life as he ponders everything that happened. His arm and chest hurt like a bitch, but that was expected when someone went against something that refused to die and could move faster than the human eye could register. The Sharingan had helped, and if Obito wasn't already such a bastard to kill, he would be dead. The demon hadn't taken kindly to Obito whisking him away from his target. And while the emotions the being felt weren't properly expressed, Obito's always been good at reading when people want him dead. Or maybe that was just because of the haze of malice around the being. The demons here felt so much like Zetsu it fucking pissed him off. He wanted nothing more than to wring that damn plant's neck. But he couldn't. Not on his own. As much as he hated to admit it, Minato was the only one who could kill the damned plant. Now he just wondered if Minato would help him do it. Because if there was anyone Minato wanted dead more than anyone else, it was Obito. His lips twist as he closes his eyes. He promised her he'd try. How cruel she was, to send him to his death just so he could redeem himself. Then again, after everything he'd done. Redemption in her eyes was all he could hope for. Chapter 38. Mizukage and Hokage, Bird and a Flower. It was telling that when Shinjiro entered his living room to find yet another Jinchuriki sitting at his table, he didn't even bat an eye. Minato was joined by more tag-alongs. It was par for the course for the man. Alongside the pale-haired man with vibrant pink eyes, there was a woman with dark hair and bright blue eyes, a boy who bore a striking resemblance to her, and another child who was crying. They made quite the group. Shinjiro only pegged the Jinchuriki because of the haze of chakra surrounding the man. It was much more vibrant than any of the others Shinjiro had met. It was almost unsettling, and had Minato not been sitting in front of the man and talking amicably, Shinjiro might have been wary. As it was, he just greeted his wife with a kiss, his youngest with a hug when he bounded over, and searched the room for his eldest. Kyojuro should have been home, but he wasn't present. Flitting his eyes again, Shinjiro pulsed his chakra. He caught the way that the newcomer's pink eyes flicked to him sharply, but he paid it no mind. He was getting better at sensing the kids and telling them apart. It came in handy when the Rengoku household was filled with over a dozen occupants on a semi-regular basis. Just the Kamados alone filled the previously empty halls. Not that he was complaining. Words could not describe the joy he felt coming home to a house filled with laughter and tiny bodies causing mischief. The Kamados would always have a place in his home, as would any of the other slayers who had come through. There, sitting on the roof of his estate, was his son. And he wasn't alone. An unfamiliar signature resided with him, as well as Hiroko. His brow furrowed. He knew that the kids rather liked to seclude themselves on the rooftops when they were dealing with things. Hiroko had infected all the others with her habit of climbing up high, and paired with the ability to scale pretty much every surface, nowhere was off limits. It was a common sight to find even the youngest children climbing trees and walls. There had been several heart attack moments for the group as they grew used to children with access to chakra. He drifted his gaze back to Minato, finding the man eyeing him. Their gaze met and Minato swallowed thickly before looking down. His hands were gripped tightly in front of him and a look of grief flashed. No. A sudden surge of something rushed through Shinjiro. He and his family had worked so hard to remove that look from the man's face. They had fought and strove to give Minato happiness. Shinjiro couldn't remember the last time he saw such raw grief on his friend's face. A burning surge to amend it filled him. "I see you found another Jinchuriki. And some more kids to collect," Shinjiro offers, testing the grounds with the familiar jab at Minato's penchant for collecting children. It earns him a weak smile, which is telling. He files the thought away as he takes a seat across from the newcomers. He then inclines his head, eyes trailing from the main focus over to the others as he introduces himself. "My name is Rengoku Shinjiro, but you can call me Shinjiro. This is my estate, but it's also home to most of the others, including the Jinchuriki." And that too was true. Han and Roshi had all but overtaken the west half of his home after he offered it. There was hardly a day that passed by that Han wasn't seen with small children scaling his huge form. It got even worse when he helped the Jinchuriki kids train, though he was at least more careful than Roshi was. The man nods, and he inclines his head. "I am Karitachi Yagura, but Yagura is fine," Yagura offers. Then, the woman speaks up. "My name is Hashibara Kotoha. This is my son Inosuke," she says, gesturing to the boy all but vibrating in his seat while he stares at Shinjiro. He has a feral air to him that gives Shinjiro pause. It's both like that of the Jinchuriki and not. And this boy is someone we saved from demons. I believe he said his name was Zenitsu? Quote. The boy, Zenitsu, stops crying. He sniffles as he turns his gaze over to the woman. Shinjiro wants to comment on that, but he's dealt with enough oddballs that he just remains silent. Minato clears his throat, sighing. Perhaps, Inosuke, Zenitsu, you both could go with Ruka to get cleaned up? And I believe that the Kamado siblings are playing in the garden if you would like to unwind a little. Tanjiro is around your age, as is Nezuko. For a moment, Kotoha looks unsure. But then Yagura hums and nods. He turns to Inosuke and gestures with his hands. Shinjiro recognizes the signs as shinobi hand signs, though these must be specific to Yagura's village. He only knows what Minato taught them, and those aren't quite the same. The way that Yagura gestures seems entirely different in pacing and fluidity too. They are similar to Japanese Sign Language, the little bits that Shinjiro does know, by the speed and fluidity is just different. It's interesting regardless, considering the similarities of their world and Minato's. Whatever it is, Inosuke seems to understand well enough as he flashes something back. He puffs up his chest and nods sharply. He then grabs Zenitsu, and the boy yelps as he's dragged away. Shinjiro eyes Minato carefully, wondering if perhaps he should call for some of the others. He refrains, referring to Minato for what will happen next. Minato looks tense as he stares down their guests. Then, almost like a mask slipped over his features, he offers a kind smile. I apologize, but I figured they would be more comfortable outside of this conversation. Now, I believe where we left off was your reasoning for joining the Demon Slayer Corps, correct? Minato asks. Shinjiro listens even more intently at that. They wished to join? While the invite had been pretty much open to all the Jinchuriki, something told Shinjiro that this was a special case. Perhaps it had to do with the respect in Minato's voice. He had mentioned that one of the Jinchuriki was like him, a former village leader. Shinjiro could easily pin Yagura for that title. Yagura nods. He levels a keen stare on his fellow shinobu before he speaks. Almost since I landed in this world, I have been running with Kotoha and Inosuke from a powerful demon. I was growing tired of such things, and I don't wish for my family to live in fear. Yagura reaches, taking Kotoha's hand. The woman straightens and turns to gaze at him. There is something soft in her eyes and she edges just a little closer before she speaks up. The demon's name is Doma. He's the leader of a cult. And, from what I know, he's a very powerful demon. The boy from earlier called him the prismatic demon, but I know that his eyes mark him as Upper Moon too. Kotoha informs them. Shinjiro goes still at that notion. Upper Moon too. And that description, wasn't that? He jerks his head at Minato and the man's eyes are hard as he nods. His smile hasn't melted away, but it's a dangerous thing. One sliver away from feral. It's the look of a trained killer and not something that Shinjiro is used to seeing on his friend, for all that he knows of the man's past. This is the feared and famed Yellow Flash. This is the man who slaughtered countries. He's oh so glad that the demons didn't get their hands on him before the demon slayers did. Doma. He is also someone who is after two of our own. A Hashira named Sarumi Hattori, and my daughter, Hiroko, Minato voices. His tone drops just a tad, the dangerous edge picking up. He's ever the protector. Ever the defender. Always willing to put everything he has into keeping those he deems his safe. Shinjiro shares the sentiment. He thinks about his wife and his sons, wondering how he would feel if they were hunted by a demon. It fills him with an unimaginable rage. So deep and tethered that he has to watch his breathing and his chakra to make sure it doesn't spark. Even so, the room grows warmer for a few seconds before he gets it under control. Minato nods at him and then turns back to Yagura. The Jinchuriki is eyeing them both carefully. It's the same type of look Minato gets when he's solving a complex problem or developing a strategy. Were all shinobi this way? Or was it just the caliber of shinobi these two were? Then we have a common enemy. I am willing to lend my hand to whatever the cause if it ensures their safety. And I suppose Zenitsu's too, since he has come under my protection. The man relays, his eyes flickering with something as he looks back at Kotoha. Kotoha is chewing on her lip and keeps glancing from Yagura's hand up to Minato. She looks like she wants to speak but doesn't feel the time is right. What could that be about? Minato nods, and the arrangement reminds Shinjiro of all those years ago when Minato had offered him the same thing. It's a parallel he didn't expect. I will bring you to the master, and the others. Well, they've all been introduced, so it's only fair. Though B isn't currently here. Which is something I should ask Hiryu-san about, if he's amicable. Minato murmurs and glances up where Shinjiro knows his son is. Which both answers some of Shinjiro's questions and adds so many more. Why is Hiryu Akuto here? And why was he with Kyojuro and Hiroko? Shinjiro had a lot to catch up on, it seemed. Yes. Which? I would also like to discuss something with the boy. Yagura suddenly brings up. Minato glances back at the man and they share gazes for a moment before Yagura reiterates. I want to ask why he was with Uchiha Madara. Shinjiro wasn't quite prepared for the mess that happened after that. But really, how could he have planned for Minato snapping? To-san. Tanjiro looks up to find his second eldest son running over to him. He's laughing happily, holding Nezuko on his shoulders. Chakra runs through his limbs as he laughs and his sister cheers rambunctiously. Tanjiro is always filled with joy, smiling and offering a gentle presence for everyone. But he's also spent a lot of time with the likes of Naruto and Kyojuro, spurring his more curious and playful nature. It's a welcomed sight and it fills him with warmth every time he sees it. Careful, Tanjiro. A deep tone calls. Gaara steps around the bend of the house, dressed in pale robes with a purple haori around his shoulders. It was decorated with different flowers, each one representing each of his siblings. It was a gift for his coming of age since he agreed to not take the earrings until Tanjiro was also of age. His right ear is pierced, however, and from it hangs a simple wooden talisman that Ruka had carved for him. It had the kanji for one within it, and she had made similar pieces for each of the Jinchuriki. Naruto proudly wore his as a necklace, while Fu had a bracelet with a leather cord on her wrist. The others all had varying styles that suited each of them. Minato had a matching set to Naruto's, but both of them had black and white pieces that slotted together as a yin and yang set. Gaara reaches out, steadying Nezuko when she nearly falls off. His expression softens when the girl lunges for him with a laugh. Tanjiro doesn't abort his path and skids to a stop next to Tanjiro so he can hug him by his waist. Tanjiro's gaze flits from his eldest children to behind them. There's the common sight of the rest of the kids trailing after Gaara, though his youngest is sleeping in another room. Senjuro is with the boys, his eyes bright and filled with wonder as he talks about something or the other with Rokuta. Aha, you must be the leader. A voice hollers, one that Tanjiro doesn't know. Then, he sidesteps as a blur slides past him. He blinks, and it's only when sand rushes and catches the figure as they try to strike that he gets a good look at their face. They are feminine looking, but muscle is building from what he can see. The boy also has a feral smile on his lips that Tanjiro only ever recalls seeing on Fu before. He blinks, wondering when they got another kid. Wouldn't Minato have introduced them? And then, he hears a soft whine. He looks down to find another boy on the ground. He looks like he was dragged and left there. His hair is a brown color and looks like it hasn't been washed for some time. Tanjiro is just about to kneel to ask if the boy is alright when he promptly bursts into tears. Tearing his gaze from where Gaara is asking the other boy who he is, only to receive demands for a fight in return, Tanjiro kneels next to the boy. Are you alright? He asks, reaching out and placing a hand over the bruised knee the boy is holding. He pulls at his chakra, and though it takes a second, he sees the green hue come into being. The boy stalls his cries, sniffling again as he looks down at the glowing hand. Why you? You have the same thing they do, he mumbles. His words are hard to make out past his quiet tone and the sniffling, but Tanjiro manages. Others? Ah, am I to assume Minato picked you up? Tanjiro asks with a bit of mirth. As much as a running joke as Minato's kidnapping was, it had some merit. They were always expecting him to bring home more strays. The boy blinked, and then he nodded a little. Sort of. The pretty lady saved me, and he took us here, he murmurs. And then, someone whips around Tanjiro's side. Nezuko practically spawns into being, making the boy jump in fright. He screams and Tanjiro winces from the volume. But what follows is interesting to say the least. You feel sad. Why? Nezuko asks as she stares at the boy. She doesn't seem to care that she just made him jump 3 feet. The boy, rather than reply in the same quiet tone Tanjiro had just grown used to, promptly bursts into tears again. And then, he reaches out, grabbing Nezuko's hand. You're beautiful, marry me before I die. Quote. Tanjiro can only stare. What? Nezuko giggles at him, reaching out to pat his head. Nope. I'm marrying someone who can fight, but if you become strong, maybe. She says. She tugs herself from his grip, which is kinda impressive, and then turns to march over to where Gaara has managed to get the other boy to settle while Tanjiro talks to him. The boy stares after Nezuko, reaching up to touch where she patted his head. Tanjiro isn't sure what to think of that interaction. Should he be upset? I mean, his daughter was his little girl. But he also thought the kid meant no harm. He wasn't quite on the level of Minato, who had threatened Tengen the last time he jokingly asked Hiroko and Mikomo to be his wives. Though the man hadn't tried again after Yugito kicked his ass 12 ways to Tokyo. He hummed and just reached down, ruffling the boy's hair. No harm was done, and the boy didn't seem bad. At least from what Tanjiro could tell. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he was lonely and didn't know how to express those things. Tanjiro could at least tell the boy was a gentle soul. The boy stared up at him in bewildered wonder, mouth slightly parted in surprise. Which of course, was about the time that the house exploded. Chapter 39. Deadly Emotions, Choices Defined. What did you just say? Quote. Minato's mind is running faster than he can note, his thoughts moving and churning. He stares at Yagura as the world hazes over. It's like he's lost, searching for light in the darkness. Ash in his lungs. He's staring up at a man he thought to call his brother. He only dares to meet Fugaku's gaze because of the seal Shisui helped him create. There's hatred in those eyes. All he feels is grief and betrayal. Then, Yagura speaks again. I asked why the boy, Hiryu Akuto, stood with Uchiha Madara. He used his Sharingan, the one that allows him to warp places, Yagura reiterates, but the mere mention of the specific ability, that specific ability, is enough. Blurs across his vision, a whip of wind and then heat. He dodges, flickers away, and reappears with his Rasengan aimed at the aggressor. He sees the white mask first. It doesn't take much to remember the man who targeted his family so readily. Minato hadn't shared those facts with the other villages after he was attacked. Maybe he should have, but he hadn't wanted to reveal what transpired that night or make the other villages think of Konoha as weakened. Not when the war had finished only a few years prior and he was still nursing his wounds from that night. If he had, would it have changed things? The mask shatters. Minato stalls. He can't quite breathe as he stares at the familiar face behind it. Choppy black hair, and while half of him is warped and twisted from healing with something inhuman, there's no mistaking who it is. How many times will he be betrayed tonight? The only way that Yagura would know about the masked Uchiha, about Obito, would be if he saw him in person. Something harsh and bitter tugs at him, and though deep down the rational part of Minato wants to hear out Yagura and learn everything he knows about Obito, he doesn't. Because he is not acting on rationality. He is not acting on wit or intellect. He is acting on his emotions. On the emotions he's kept at bay and swept deep into his heart with the hope that he'd never have to think about them again. He's swept in the past and all the ghosts it brings. Kushina's beauty was unrivaled even in the worst of moments. Her hair let free as she stared down the boy who she used to tease about his crush. In her eyes is a fire that has almost died from Minato, for all that he keeps fighting. I'm not gonna let you attack my family or my village anymore, ya know. That's not who the red-hot habanero is. Minato's always been the one protecting her, protecting everyone. But at that moment, she was the one protecting him. And she did so without holding back. Even though it killed her in the end. He could still taste the blood from her final kiss. Her smile was cemented in his thoughts. Brilliant and red with blood as it washed over her entirely, chains pulsing and Uzumaki vitality put to the test. Her form flickering through the area almost faster than even Minato could move. Her screams of rage and anger echoed in his thoughts too. The sounds of Obito's bones breaking followed. And the most prominent emotion he feels right now is the bright red edge of rage. He doesn't need to see it happen. Not when he feels it so deeply in his chest, even as he's tugged away by a familiar set of hands. Makoto stares at him with tears in her eyes. And he realizes then, that he's not the only one whose world is falling apart. It doesn't ease his pain in the slightest. He flickers, vanishing from where he is situated with the other former cage. He reappears nearest to the signature above the rooftop, his thoughts all echoing one thought. They all focus on the one person who he swore was dead. Who he hoped was gone. Uchiha Obito. Uchiha Obito was alive. Uchiha Obito was alive and here. How many of the people that Minato cared about were in danger? The man had already threatened his son and practically killed his wife. Obito may have once been one of Minato's students, but he lost the right to any sort of sympathy or willingness to talk that Minato had when he turned Konoha on its cage and its people. Konoha has oppressed the Uchiha for long enough, Minato. We deserve more. You brought this upon us by defending that monster. Quote. You should have just let the Jinchuriki go. Uchiha Obito incited insurrection and deception in his bid for the Jinchuriki, with no care for how Konoha fell in the aftermath. If it was even still standing after Minato was forced to flee. And while Minato knew his village was strong, knew the way it grew back stronger with each hit. There were few buildings left standing. The Uchiha and Akatsuki had assured that much. Minato watched as his beloved village burned around him. He swallowed back the ache and the pain and looked at Makoto. So many bodies littered the streets, including her son's. And yet she stood tall, even as she openly cried and showed her grief. Even as she prepared to kill her husband and end his treachery. All for the sake of the only son she had left. Live. Ensure your son survives. Don't let their sacrifices be in vain. And he did. With his son in hand, safe because of Shisui's quick actions and thinking, Minato ran and ran while his village burned behind him. He also knew that sometimes when a tree is burned, not even the seeds are left to sprout anew. And Konoha had been attacked at its very roots. Children were the kings. But Minato had failed even them. He did not linger on the bodies in the streets for all that it broke him to run past them. He flickered, tugging on Hiruzen. He did not think he could bear to see any more of his friends, of his people, dead. Blue eyes sparked with something when Minato appeared, matching his own both in shade and coldness. Akuto reached for his blade on reflex, but Minato had been a shinobi far longer than he had been a demon slayer. He grabbed the boy's wrist, jerking him over the roof. His chakra pulsed under his skin while his eyes shifted over his target. Blood on his hands. The taste of copper on his tongue and coating his throat. He doesn't know if Naruto is the one screaming or if it's him. Drowning in it as it surrounded him. The ghosts of his actions tugged him down. Those he killed, those he failed to protect, and those who wanted his destruction. Cold steel was reflected in them. Their warmth was lost to the well of anger under his skin. Uchiha Obito, he demands, his voice clipped and short. Even his words bring an unfamiliar chill, so deep that it burns. And maybe Minato is burning. Maybe he's burning under the weight of everything crashing down, and the memories of a night where so much went wrong and too many died. Where he had the blood of the people he swore to protect on his hands while one of his friends tried to justify tearing down everything they fought for. Maybe he was burning from the chakra that worked over his skin as he tugged at Hiruzen and jumped, a whirlwind of colors turning his thoughts to nothing until he was lost. Akuto looks back at him, rising from where he was thrown. His eyes flicker from Minato back to where he had been. Minato doesn't look. Not when he needs to know the truth. So he doesn't see the large hole his actions put in the roof. He doesn't see where his chakra burned across the woodwork like a flare. And he does not see the way the Kyuubi's chakra is starting to rise about him in a demonic shroud. All he sees is the boy in front of him and the figment of another behind him. Akuto settles into a more defensive stance, not that it would do him much good when Minato could easily go for his throat. A boy of his training, no matter how good, would never match a cage. They called him their hero. But heroes are only those who survive to write their stories. They still wade through the blood of those they suppress in the name of their ideals. He was no different. The bastard did say you'd react badly. Minato looked at Obito one last time as Raida and the others held him back. He met the man's gaze, but he turned away as a cry of fury echoed. A body hit the floor. Kakashi went flying past him. The sickening squelch of something tearing through flesh echoed in his ears. But he jumped. And the rage that Obito felt was all but echoed in Minato's soul. Minato stills. He swallows, but his ears are ringing. He doesn't think he's ever been this angry before. If he were still coherent, perhaps he would note just how terrifying that was. But he's not. Why would you do it, Obito? Exclamation mark. Why would you destroy all that you fought and died for? Quote. It takes effort to focus on Akuto's words that follow, but he tracks the boy's lips regardless. He wanted to send a message. The Akatsuki will have the Jinchuriki sensei. And then, we will create a new world. You'll know how to reach me so we can talk. Minato goes so still that not even air leaves his lips. Total concentration flickers out for the first time in years. He can feel the tug on his senses already as he searches for his seals. None of the ones he's used in this world before. None of the seals on the people he cares about. But instead, a seal on a man who tore his whole world from him. Vicious satisfaction filled him as he tagged his former student. The seal glinted on his skin and Minato bore his teeth. The rage of the Kyuubi bubbled on his skin. "You'll never be free of me now." A brush of a hand across Obito's shoulder, and a casual glance in Minato's direction. "You won't live long enough to put it to use, sensei." Friendly faces, now riddled with shock and worry. The bright hair accented by red. Dark hair much the same and a gentle demeanor. Small faces that only knew him for his happy nature and his protective instincts now fragmented with confusion and fear. Minato. Quote. Two heads of blonde hair, both figures he had come to call family. One set with blue eyes akin to his own filled with terror. Naruto looked up at him. He was just as lost as Minato. He was all Minato had left. And maybe that's why, when he clung tighter to the boy, Naruto only clung back. To San. Quote. Minato couldn't lose anyone else to Obito. He makes his decision, and unbeknownst to him, another sees the moment the thought flickers. And they move. Their voices echoed across the landscape. But all that was left was the haze of a yellow flash, flickering out in the evening light. Three figures vanish without a sound. Drabble. Another. He peers at the woman sat at the desk. For once, his normal book is not present. And while that may be attributed to the girl standing at his side, others know the real reason. Kakashi has never had the best track record when it came to those he cared about surviving long. Obito, dead but not quite. Rin, suicide via his signature technique. Kushina, burning brightly even as her chakra tore through her and her screams became etched into the very foundations of the village. Minato and Naruto. They weren't dead. And that was the whole reason Kakashi was here. Hokage-sama? He says, and it still sounds wrong to address the woman as such. It should be another in her seat. Someone that Kakashi had once called sensei. Tsunade doesn't take offense. She never has. I have one last mission for you, Kakashi. He pauses at her wording. Last? And he's not the one to ask this time. The head of pink hair at his side is the one to ask. Her voice is soft and inquisitive, but Kakashi has been in charge of the little Helion long enough to tell when she's reading between the lines. Tsunade offers a tired smile. There's every chance you won't be able to return, she murmurs. Her words hang in the air. But Kakashi already knows his decision. A quick glance down at his charge earns him a confident nod. For all that the girl is young, Sakura has never been one to shy away from the dangers of their life. Not after her parents died. Not after Kakashi started training her in earnest, taking her in when no one else would. A lot of children lost their homes and families when Konoha was attacked. Too many still called the streets home. Ma, if you are going to send us after sensei, when do we go? Quote. Tsunade's smile softens at that. And then, she begins to brief Kakashi on the mission. Including who will be joining them. It will be an interesting endeavor, Orochimaru voices, his lips curling slyly. Naruto must have grown a lot by now. Shisui hums, his eyes flicking over to the boy at his side. Sasuke doesn't respond, though he does glance at his cousin and guardian briefly to acknowledge his words. Minato as well. Genma speaks next, tilting his head with a wry look. The senbon between his lips rolls, and Kakashi doesn't quite recall when the man entered. But that sort of thing is commonplace when you give an assassin a technique like Hirishin. They all know the risks. And all of them are willing to take them. Chapter 40. Shuddered Breaths, Brother in Arms. The first thing Minato notices when he drops into the space is the snowfall. It's thick here, falling over his lashes as flakes dance in flurries around him. The next thing he notices is the familiar figure seated at the edge of a fire. Their lone gray eye shifts over to him. Surprise flickers over their features, but Minato doesn't give it a second longer. He's moving, his kunai drawn in a flurry. Murder is in his mind's eye. And while Minato hasn't been a shinobi for years, hasn't handled a blade with the intent to kill anyone but a demon in so long. He was raised a shinobi. And old patterns are hard to break. Obito doesn't move. He remains where he is as Minato draws closer. And yet Minato knows. He knows the Uchiha could flicker away, could turn intangible, and render his action pointless. This is why he stalls as he slams into the man, knocking him on his back. He doesn't drive the blade home and instead crouches on Obito's chest while the edge of his weapon draws a line of red at the Uchiha's neck. "Hello there, sensei," Obito murmurs in greeting. Minato's arm shakes. He sees flashes of so many behind his mind's eye. He sees Raida, Itachi, Hiruzen, and Kushina. He thinks about all the families who lost loved ones because of a power grab. Obito lost his right to call Minato sensei. He lost that right a long time ago. And the fact that he still has that word on his lips? The very fact he has the audacity to call Minato what should have been a lifelong endearment. Minato's rage doubles down. His earlier hesitance over Obito's lack of escape vanishes with it. He presses down and only someone else's interference keeps him from cutting through Obito's jugular. Minato rolls when the form hits him, and then he whirls around. Blue cuts through the hazy darkness, capturing the black at the edge. A familiar set of blue eyes meet his own and Akuto stands between him and his target. Minato recovers too fast for the boy to register. Then he appears next to him, slamming an arm roughly across the boy's shoulders and cutting a leg under his feet. He goes down with a cry. Minato doesn't linger. His eyes are back on the figure still lying prone in the snow. Then, another pulls in front of Minato. This one causes him to pause. If only because Minato doesn't have the heart to step through them. Red hair hangs around his face in thick waves, his red eyes bright as they flicker with firelight. Tanjiro stands tall in the snow as he watches Minato carefully. "Minato, stop," Tanjiro murmurs. Despite his volume, the words he speaks might as well be shouted in Minato's ears. There's a dull thrum resounding from the depths of his soul. His heart pounds and the blood rushes through his limbs like wildfire. Minato is beholden to the feeling. He's never quite felt bloodlust like this. Not to the point where it spikes along his skin and the chakra of Kyuubi lingers dangerously close to the surface. His anger has never reached this point. Until now. Tanjiro's gaze is soft and kind as he keeps it on Minato. "Please, Minato, just stop for a moment," he says again, and this time he takes a small step closer. Every sense in Minato's body flickers and wavers as he grows closer to the edge. Suddenly breathing isn't as easy. It's rushed. He's not in control. "Tanjiro, You have no idea what he's done. Move aside, Minato utters. His tone is sharp, and malice drips off of each word. Panic too drips and wells, coating the ground like blood. Tanjiro stares at him calmly. He does not look over his shoulder, back at the murderer. He keeps his eyes on Minato. I won't. Minato, you need to calm down. Minato's teeth shift and a sharp sound rings out as he moves. He goes around Tanjiro, whipping forward with his kunai again. And because of that, he's not able to witness what happens behind him. But Akuto and Obito do. They watch as Tanjiro closes his eyes and breathes. And then he's moving, flickering and grabbing Minato by his arm and dragging him down. He's nothing but a blur of robes as he goes. Minato makes an aborted sound of shock as he hits the snow with Tanjiro above him. The man breathes. Total concentration constant is active and funneling strength through him. His red eyes glimmer again, but Minato sees something entirely different when he looks up at his friend. Minato. Breathe, he says again. Minato jerks, trying to remove himself from the man's grip without hurting him. Only, he hadn't realized just how strong Tanjiro had become. Without his sickness tugging him closer and closer to death, and with his prowess strengthened by the fine-tuned breathing exercises, the man was able to push him down into the cold snow. Something racks Minato as he feels the pressure on his limbs. He gazes up at his friend and realizes that he can't breathe. His lungs ache in the cold air. And for once, he's shivering. His whole body trembles. Then, the blade falls from his grasp. Tanjiro's gaze softens considerably as he presses down on him. Minato, breathe for me. And this time Minato listens. This time he breathes. But with that intake comes a rush of spasms and gasps. And it's only after the third breath that Minato realizes he's crying. Tears slip over his eyes. He's struggling to tug it under wraps, but the ache in his chest has finally been released and he can't quite hold onto the anger that overcame him before. He was a hair's breadth from cracking under the pressure before, which left him with nothing else to do after his anger slipped by. Tanjiro gently gripped his shoulder and tugged him up. Minato slipped against the man. His body shook too much for him to do more than lean on his friend. Danger still rang about his senses. He knew he shouldn't be breaking down here. Not when the threat wasn't dealt with. But it was like that day with Naruto and Shinjiro all over again. Once the grief started, he couldn't wrap it back up again. Perhaps if he was still a shinobi. Maybe Minato could manage it if he hadn't spent the last few years learning how to be human again. The kids had weakened him. Friends had weakened him. But they also gave him an unfathomable amount of strength. You scared me for a moment there, Tanjiro murmured against his shoulder. Minato choked as he started to measure his breathing in an effort to get it under control. It was slow going. Stuttered breaths left his chest as pain coursed like needles in his lungs. He hadn't had a panic attack in years. You felt entirely different. All of your emotions, they didn't feel like you, Tanjiro tells him, his voice quiet and sincere. There has never been a moment that Minato heard fear in his friend's voice. Not like that. Tanjiro's grip tightens before the man lets out a heavy sigh. Minato had forgotten that the man was more in tune with other emotions than the average person. Actually, his whole family was. Which made something akin to horror well inside Minato's chest. A hand thumped the back of his skull as Minato was starting to slow his pulse. He wasn't shaking as much, minor trembles over his arms and legs were all that remained. His breathing stuttered from the hit and he winced despite the fact it didn't hurt. Don't get those thoughts. It's alright. The kids will be okay, Tanjiro says. It's like he could read Minato's mind. No, I just know you that well. The man replies again, and this time it earns him a snort and a look from the Namikaze. The gesture is tired, barely there. Minato feels worn. Tanjiro meets his look with a soft and fond smile. The gentle atmosphere is broken, however, by the clearing of a throat. Minato's whole body goes rigid and only Tanjiro's hand on his shoulder keeps him down. They both turn to look at the offender. Obito has sat up in the snow and he's watching the two of them with an odd set to his face. Confusion, but also a tad bit of relief, Minato realizes with a twist in his chest. He swallows back bile and anger again, trying to remain composed. He can't help how overwhelmed he feels staring at Obito. He can't help how every fiber of him wants to rip and tear. Obito had torn everything that Minato was and could be. He had stripped Minato down to the essential parts of himself, and removed as much as he could. Minato had only stitched himself back together after because he had to. If Naruto hadn't been there, if it had just been him, then there's every chance he wouldn't have survived. Well, now that you aren't going for my throat, Obito begins. A primal growl leaves Minato's lips. He's grateful it doesn't hitch with his breath. Don't fucking test me. And that draws a surprised and appraising glance from the Uchiha. The mixture of the Kyuubi's primal tone and Minato's voice is interesting. Paired with the visible fangs along Minato's features? It's rather obvious that Minato wasn't the only one angry. And maybe that explained why Minato's emotions felt like both his, and not. Because Kurama had every right to be just as angry at Obito as Minato was. Perhaps it's best if I don't explain, Obito mutters. And then, he tilts his head and his eye swirls. Minato tenses, reaches for the seal that stops his will from being taken. And feels it blocked. His eyes dart to the marking in panic, though not fast enough as the Sharingan tugs at him. He sees the sealing paper along his arm, pasted on not long ago. Likely when Akuto shoved him aside. And then, he's tugged through hell again. Tanjiro catches Minato's form as he slumps over, his eyes wide. He glances sharply at the man still sitting in the snow. Obito flickers his gaze down at Minato, and then up behind Tanjiro. You're lucky he didn't kill you. Tanjiro twists just slightly to look behind him. Akuto is walking over and holding his arm where Minato threw him. He grimaces as he nods. I held my part of the bargain, you hold yours, the boy voices. His hair has fallen loose in the scuffle, cascading around his face in an array of black silk. Like that, it's hard for Tanjiro to not see the boy's father in him. Don't worry about him. He's just having an overdue conversation. Obito suddenly speaks up. Tanjiro angles his eyes back to the man to find him on his feet. He's stretching his arms over his head, grimacing as the mood tugs at his scars. They're horrendous, marking a good half of his body in a way that Tanjiro hasn't seen since the Master. But they are at least healed, where the Master's wounds are constantly worsening. Come on, I set up in an abandoned shack nearby. Obito voices, turning to march off into the darkened landscape. The moon shines overhead, but with the copse of trees providing a thick cover, it struggles to reach the snow-covered ground. A hand reaches down and Tinkoro notes the scarring on it as Akuto offers him a hand to help him up. Obito is a bastard, but he's not going to hurt Blondie. Well, not now. They have a bit to discuss from what I gathered. And this is the best way to do it, Akuto says with a sigh. Tanjiro takes the offered hand, but only because he can feel the warmth emanating from the former soldier. Even with all that has happened, Tanjiro isn't operating as though the two of them are his enemies. He doesn't see the need to. Not when their intentions might as well be written on their faces, the echoes of their emotions plain for him to see. His breathing shifts as he moves Minato to an easier position to haul along. Akuto pauses and then sighs, reaching over to help him out. "You seem calm about this," the young man comments. Tanjiro's smile changes, becoming mildly sad. "I suppose. But I know neither of you mean any harm," he reveals. Akuto stops for a second at that, eyeing the Kamado critically, before he focuses on the task at hand. They reach Obito's rundown hideout quickly and settle in. Only once Minato has been laid down on a spare futon and the two of them have settled does the conversation continue. "Toussaint mentioned. Well, he mentioned he had a friend who could see your inner thoughts. I guess you're that one?" Akuto asks. Tanjiro blinks at the admission but nods. He can assume as much. "Seems like a latent sensing ability, but the fuck do I know?" Obito voiced as he returned from wherever he went. He dropped tattered blankets down next to them before tending to the fire in the hearth. Tanjiro makes an aborted shrug, looking back down at his friend. Minato had voiced something similar at some point, but they both agreed there was something more to it. Tanjiro focuses on it, catching the warm haze and the way it works around Minato. Shock, pain, grief, and joy. A bitter joy. Whatever the man was experiencing, it wasn't a danger to him. At least not enough for Tanjiro to step in. He closes his eyes and lets his body settle. The hum of his new companions is there in his mind's eye. Akuto, with the bright pulse of protection and loyalty that runs so deep. There's also an undercurrent of loss and grief, but it's overshadowed by anger. Obito is. He's a lot of things. But the most prominent to Tanjiro is the most telling. Because the emotion that lies most heavily on Obito's heart is regret. Drabbled dead woman talking. Minato whirls on Obito with a taloned hand, but Obito just sidesteps the blow. His gaze is sad as he looks at the angry form of his sensei. Or, former sensei, if Minato's earlier reaction was anything to go by. And then, he's not the one pulling Minato back. It's not the redhead from earlier either. It's a brunette figure who grabs Minato's arm and holds him steady. It's a figure with soft and warm brown eyes who stares the man down this time. Minato stalls, but this time in shock rather than losing himself to the emotions buried in his chest. Rin smiles softly at the man, cheeks stretching from how genuine it is. "Hey, Minato-sensei." Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. My apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening or night. See you next time, faves.